Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a real opportunity actually to take a call immediately after the Minister to speak to some of the points that she has raised. Because she's right to point out that on this side of the House, as opposition, we take our roles very seriously. We use evidence as the basis of our positions and as the basis of the arguments that we make in this chamber. And so, of course, it was to the evidence that we looked when we formulated our own plans around child hardship. So when it comes to part one, because of course we need to keep in mind, of course, this is a bill whose primary purpose is packaged up as reducing hardship for children. So when we look at the evidence base around that, what does it tell us that we should be doing on behalf of those children? Well, in part one, the Minister, as she's rightly pointed out, part one, clauses 4, changes the definition of part-time work to 20 hours. Now, the argument being made by the Minister, of course, is that by increasing the threshold of hours that are expected to be worked by families who are on benefits, that we increase income, we increase engagement in the workforce, therefore we presumably reduce hardship in the home. That is not always going to be the case. Firstly, we need to take into account, of course, the abatement regimes that apply to households who are benefit households. So if the government truly wanted to focus on increasing the income of these homes, then they would also be looking at abatement and the impact of abatement on families who are in part-time work whilst also receiving a benefit. That would have been a useful combination of issues to look at, because simply increasing the hours required in the threshold test doesn't necessarily have that wider impact. And we as a party have looked at that. We've got a very clear view on the need to increase the amount of hours that a benefit family can earn and keep before they start seeing their benefit abate. So that would have been a useful thing for the government to do. And in fact, they could have voted for our bill, which was before the House not too long ago. So that would have been a nice thing to add to clause 4 if they were going to increase those hours. The second claim that the Minister's made was that when you look at the evidence around benefit households and their transition back into work, obviously we are primarily talking about sole parent households. They tend to transition into work at the time that their child turns 3 or 4, already, before a law change. Because of course this piece of legislation in clauses 4, 6, 7 and 8 reduces the age of children at which the work requirement kicks in for parents from age 5 to age 3. And the point that the Minister just made herself was that actually, by and large, parents are already doing that. Why? Because they want to work. Because they know that in the longer term, even if in that moment, abatement regimes being what they are, in the longer term they end up being better off if they are able to put themselves back into stable employment. Those who can do at that age, 3 and 4. And that's the point that we're trying to make on this side of the House. Those who can do, but it is not a given that that is going to be the best thing for every single family. You may have a family with a child or children that have special needs. You may have a situation where a family is able to find 15 hours that work around ECE, but 20 they're unable to find, and will tack on an extra bit of after-hours cleaning that doesn't quite work, but they juggle to try and reach the requirements set out by the government, and it then has a wider negative impact on their family makeup. Those who can do, those who can't, often have very legitimate rationale, and all that we're saying is that for those extra 2 years, for that extra 2 years of making it mandated, what gains are we making if predominantly those families who can already are moving into work? And what might be some of those barriers, Mr. Chair, to clause 4, 6, 7 and 8 being complied with? Well, we've covered some of them off already. The availability of work at hours that are conducive or sit in alignment with ECE hours is one of them. Now, again, another thing the government could have done in part 1, if it wanted to ease the pain of trying to find work that worked around early childhood education, they could have increased the hours. They could have increased the hours, the free hours available to families from 20 to 25. That would mean that even if they were then bumping up the hours of work required, there might be a bit of buffer for travel time, Mr Chair. That might have been a buffer then if they were going to mandate that you had to be required to work for 20 hours. By giving 25 free hours for ECE, that would have allowed even perhaps a little buffer time to drop their child and pick their child up around that part-time work. Again, something that Labor has promoted is that increase in hours, because there's nothing to suggest that increase will have a detrimental effect, but it could ease some of the difficulties for those families. So again, another missed opportunity. Abatement, increasing the ECE hours, those all made a difference for those families if truly it was hardship that this bill was genuinely focused on, and not, as I'm afraid I've come to conclude, simply that government was giving with one hand and wanted to look like they were waving a stick with the other, rather than looking at reality. And when I say looking at reality, again, when Labor designed its package to try and ease poverty amongst children, we did look at the evidence. We looked at where children in poverty can be found. Now, the Child Poverty Monitor of 2014, a really good start for telling us where we need to target. We know now that there are 305,000 children living in poverty. That's based on income measures. So that's the number that are living on 60% or less of the median income. Those in severe poverty, those living on 50% or less, those in the hardest end of poverty, which at the time that the Children's Commission did this report was roughly 10%, we know that those often tend to be families who are benefit reliant and who have younger children, and those are the ones who are living in persistent poverty as well. And that exists from the age of 0 to 4, roughly, if we want to take an age range. So if the government was trying to create a targeted package, rather than necessarily a generic payment of up to $25 per family across the board, what they might have done was be more generous in the package, but target those families with children, say, under the age of 3 or 4. That would have made the fundamental difference to children living in poverty. And how I know that would make a difference is we did the exact same modelling the government did when we came up with our own package, and we worked out that if you genuinely wanted to make a difference to children living in poverty, $25 per family wasn't going to cut it. The gap between what these families are living on and where our average incomes are required to be to survive has grown so much that, as Jonathan Boston has modelled, you need payments that are as generous as an increase of roughly $60. So that's why our Best Start package was modelled around a $60 payment per child, and I'd love to hear the Minister's view on why she went for a per family payment rather than a per child payment, which was the recommendation that was set out by the Children's Commissioner and the Expert Advisory Group on Child Poverty. In fact, I'd be really interested in the Minister's views on some of those recommendations generally, which again suggested that those payments be heavily weighted towards children on the younger end of the spectrum, rather than our current regime, which tends to weight to older children, making assumptions about the cost of feeding and clothing and so on, which doesn't take into account that it is easier to work part-time or full-time for caregivers at that point in the child rearing stage. So weighting towards younger children also, not only because it's harder to be in work and care, but also because those are the most critical child rearing periods, that the first year of life, those 3 years of life, in fact, are the most critical in terms of attachment, brain development and so on. So that's where our support should be targeted. So, Mr Chair, those are some of the reasons why the evidence base, in our view, around clause 4, 6, 7 and 8 is contradictory. In fact, could have the counter effect of doing more harm than good, even though there is some good in this bill. The increased payment is good. We're pleased about that. Our concern was the generosity, and if, of course, there was a limit to the amount the government was going to spend, they could have made a trade-off and really weighted at one end of the spectrum. I want to use my final contribution to support the SOPs in Carmel Cepolone's name, making part-time work study an alternative to part-time work, part-time study. That gives longer-term options for families, retaining 5 as the age, and making the work requirement for parents of under 5s dependent on access to early childhood education. The Minister's mentioned that. If that's her view, that that's what's needed to make the bill work, why won't she legislate it? Give that discretion in the legislation to allow parents, if they cannot find adequate early childhood education, to not have that requirement mandated upon them in the absence of that.